Imagine walking into a room full of people laughing at a joke you find painfully obvious, discussing dreams you abandoned years ago as naive fantasies, and celebrating achievements that feel hollow to your restless mind. You smile politely, nod at the right moments, but inside a familiar weight settles on your chest, the exhausting burden of seeing too much, understanding too deeply, and feeling perpetually disconnected from the blissful ignorance that surrounds you. This is the paradox that Arthur Schopenhauer, one of history's most brilliant yet tormented philosophers, spent his entire life wrestling with. A man whose intellectual gifts became his greatest curse, whose penetrating insights into human nature left him isolated in a world that seemed content with comfortable delusions. He discovered something that most people never realize: intelligence, beyond a certain point, doesn't liberate you. It imprisons you in a cage of awareness that most minds are mercifully spared from entering. Think about the last time you tried to explain a complex idea to someone who just didn't get it. Not because they were stupid, but because their mind simply couldn't or wouldn't venture into the uncomfortable territories that yours explores naturally. Remember that moment when you realized you were speaking a different language, not of words, but of consciousness itself. That frustration you felt wasn't just communication breakdown, it was the first glimpse into the profound loneliness that haunts every truly intelligent mind. But here's where Schopenhauer's revelation becomes genuinely disturbing. He realized that the people who seemed happiest, most content and most at peace with existence, were often those who never questioned too deeply, never analyzed too thoroughly, never saw beyond the surface of things. They possessed something that his brilliant mind had cost him: the ability to live without the constant weight of understanding. Consider this unsettling truth. While you lie awake at night, your mind racing through implications and possibilities that others never even consider, they sleep peacefully in their simpler world. While you see the hidden motivations behind every social interaction, the underlying absurdity of most human pursuits, and the ultimately tragic nature of existence itself, they find genuine joy in things that strike you as superficial or meaningless. Schopenhauer called this phenomenon the curse of consciousness, the realization that intellectual development often comes at the cost of emotional peace. The more clearly you see reality, the harder it becomes to find comfort in the illusions that sustain most people's happiness. It's as if intelligence above a certain threshold becomes a burden rather than a gift, a source of suffering rather than advantage. But why does this happen? Why does the very faculty that should elevate us above ignorance and confusion instead isolate us from the simple pleasures and uncomplicated contentment that seem to come so naturally to others? Why do the smartest people often feel like outsiders in their own species, observers rather than participants in the grand theater of human experience? The answer lies in a secret that Schopenhauer discovered about human nature itself, something so profound and disturbing that it challenges everything we believe about the value of intelligence, the pursuit of knowledge, and the very goals we've been taught to aspire toward. This secret reveals why pretending to be less intelligent than you are isn't just a social strategy. It might be the key to actual happiness. What if everything you've been told about the benefits of being smart is fundamentally wrong? What if the pursuit of intellectual achievement, rather than leading to fulfillment, actually distances you from the very experiences that make life worth living? What if the price of seeing clearly is losing the ability to feel deeply? If you've ever felt that your intelligence is more of a burden than a blessing, if you've ever envied the simple contentment of those who seem blissfully unaware of life's complexities, then you're about to discover why one of history's greatest minds concluded that wisdom might actually be the enemy of happiness. Before we dive deeper into this philosophical revolution, make sure to subscribe to explore more of these challenging ideas and hit that like button. If this paradox is already making you question everything you thought you knew about the value of being smart, the journey we're about to take will fundamentally change how you view your own intelligence and whether having it is worth the price you pay. To understand why intelligence becomes a curse, we must first grasp what Schopenhauer called the will to live, the blind, irrational force that drives all human behavior. According to his philosophy, most people are unconsciously enslaved by this will, pursuing desires, ambitions, and pleasures without ever questioning the fundamental futility of it all. They want things, they get them, they want new things, an endless cycle that keeps them busy enough to avoid confronting the deeper meaninglessness that Schopenhauer believed underlies all existence. But here's where intelligence becomes problematic. The more developed your mind becomes, the more clearly you see through this elaborate illusion. You begin to recognize that most human pursuits are essentially distractions from an uncomfortable truth, that life, at its core, is suffering punctuated by brief moments of relief. You see that people chase promotions, relationships, possessions, and experiences not because these things have inherent value, but because the pursuit itself provides temporary escape from the void of existence. This is what Friedrich Nietzsche later called staring into the abyss, the moment when consciousness becomes so acute that it penetrates the comfortable lies that make ordinary life bearable. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon differently, describing it as the burden of individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole by confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and reality. The more individuated you become, the more isolated you feel from the collective unconscious that provides others with a sense of belonging and shared meaning. Viktor Frankl, drawing from his experiences in concentration camps, observed that those who survived extreme suffering often did so by clinging to simple, sometimes irrational beliefs that gave their lives meaning. The prisoners who spent their time analyzing the absurdity of their situation, questioning the fundamental justice of existence, or intellectualizing their suffering were often the first to lose hope. Those who maintained childlike faith in eventual reunion with loved ones or simple daily rituals often endured longer. This reveals a disturbing pattern. Intellectual sophistication often comes at the cost of psychological resilience. When you can see through the mechanisms that provide comfort to others, religious faith, social hierarchies, cultural narratives, romantic ideals, you're left standing naked in a universe that offers no inherent meaning or consolation. Schopenhauer called this state the wisdom of sorrow, a condition where understanding brings not enlightenment, but a profound awareness of life's essential tragedy. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon is what modern researchers call analytical rumination, the tendency of intelligent people to overanalyze situations, breaking them down into component parts until the original emotional impact is lost. Where others might feel simple joy at a beautiful sunset, the analytical mind might focus on the atmospheric conditions creating the colors, the evolutionary reasons why humans find such sights appealing, or the temporary nature of the moment. The beauty is intellectualized into abstraction. Aldous Huxley described this as the doors of perception closing as we age and become more educated. Children experience wonder at magic tricks because they haven't yet learned to analyze the mechanisms behind illusions. Similarly, adults with less analytical minds can still experience genuine awe, mystery, and simple pleasures because they don't automatically deconstruct every experience into its constituent parts. Jean-Paul Sartre explored this theme through his concept of bad faith, the ways people deceive themselves to avoid confronting the radical freedom and responsibility of existence. But here's Sartre's crucial insight. This self-deception isn't necessarily pathological. It might be adaptive. The waiter who fully embodies his role, the lover who believes in eternal romance, the worker who finds genuine meaning in routine tasks, they might be psychologically healthier than the intellectual who sees through all social roles and recognizes them as arbitrary constructions. This is why Schopenhauer began to see wisdom as potentially destructive. Knowledge, he realized, doesn't automatically lead to happiness. It often leads to what he called the hedgehog's dilemma. Like hedgehogs trying to stay warm in winter, humans need closeness for comfort, but intelligence often makes us too aware of others' flaws, motivations, and limitations to achieve genuine intimacy. We see too much, understand too deeply, and end up isolated by our own insights. The cruel irony is that the very faculty we're taught to develop, critical thinking, analysis, deep understanding, might be systematically destroying our capacity for the simple experiences that actually make life worth living. And this is just the beginning of understanding why Schopenhauer concluded that pretending to be less intelligent might not be deception, it might be survival. The most devastating consequence of excessive intelligence isn't what you gain, it's what you lose without even realizing it's gone. While society celebrates intellectual achievement, it rarely acknowledges the hidden casualties, the death of wonder, the erosion of faith, and the systematic destruction of the cognitive biases that actually protect mental health. Consider the psychological phenomenon known as depressive realism, the disturbing discovery that people with depression often have more accurate perceptions of reality than those without it. They see social situations more clearly, assess their own abilities more honestly, and predict future outcomes with greater precision. In other words, depression might not be a distortion of reality. It might be the result of seeing reality too clearly. This suggests that a certain degree of self-deception isn't just normal, it's necessary for psychological well-being. Your intelligent mind, constantly analyzing and deconstructing, systematically dismantles the protective illusions that keep others emotionally stable. When someone tells you about their exciting new relationship, you automatically calculate the statistical probability of long-term success. When they describe their career ambitions, you see the systemic inequalities and random factors that will likely determine their actual outcomes. When they express enthusiasm about political change or social movements, you recognize the historical patterns that suggest most efforts fail to create lasting impact. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition operating at a level that becomes emotionally destructive. Your brain, evolved to solve problems and identify threats, becomes trapped in a loop of perpetual analysis that finds flaws, contradictions, and limitations in everything it examines. What others experience as hope, excitement, or simple pleasure, you experience as naivety awaiting inevitable disappointment. The social consequences are equally devastating, but more subtle. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, but intelligence, above a certain threshold, creates what psychologists call cognitive isolation. You find yourself unable to participate authentically in conversations that center around shared illusions, whether they're about career fulfillment, romantic love, national pride, or personal achievement. You become a perpetual outsider, observing rather than experiencing, understanding rather than belonging. This isolation is compounded by what Schopenhauer identified as the burden of superiority without power. You can see solutions to problems that others can't even recognize as problems, but you lack the ability to implement these solutions because they require the cooperation of minds that operate on fundamentally different wavelengths. You become like a time traveler trying to explain modern technology to medieval peasants. Your insights are not just ignored, they're incomprehensible. The neurological reality makes this even more disturbing. Modern brain imaging shows that highly intelligent people often have hyperactive default mode networks, the brain regions active during rest and introspection. While others' minds can simply be without constant commentary, yours provides a running analysis of everything you experience. You can't turn off the voice that explains why moments of beauty are temporary, why achievements are meaningless in cosmic terms, or why human connections are ultimately based on mutual self-interest. This constant metacognitive awareness prevents what psychologists call flow states, those precious moments when consciousness merges completely with activity, creating genuine joy and fulfillment. Athletes describe these as peak experiences. Artists lose themselves in creation. Lovers disappear into intimacy. But your analytical mind stands guard, observing and commenting even on your own experiences, preventing the total absorption that creates life's most meaningful moments. Perhaps most tragically, excessive intelligence often leads to what Schopenhauer called the paradox of choice awareness. While others can make decisions based on intuition, emotion, or simple preference, you're paralyzed by your awareness of infinite possibilities and unintended consequences. You see too many angles, consider too many variables, and understand too clearly how arbitrary most choices ultimately are. This leads to a kind of existential paralysis, where action becomes increasingly difficult as understanding increases. The final invisible consequence is the most insidious, the gradual recognition that you might actually envy those with less intellectual capacity. You begin to notice how easily others form friendships, find meaning in their work, maintain optimism about the future, and experience genuine excitement about simple pleasures. Their limitations start to look less like deficiencies and more like protective barriers against the harsh light of total awareness. This is when Schopenhauer's most radical insight begins to make sense. What if intelligence beyond a certain point is not an evolutionary advantage, but a malfunction? What if the minds that seem limited are actually operating exactly as designed for maximum survival and well-being, while yours has developed beyond the optimal range for human flourishing? But here's where Schopenhauer's philosophy takes a revolutionary turn. He discovered that the solution isn't to become actually less intelligent, it's to master the art of strategic ignorance. The key is learning when to deploy your full analytical capacity and when to deliberately disengage it, allowing yourself to experience life at the same emotional level as those who seem naturally happier. This isn't about dumbing yourself down. It's about developing what Schopenhauer called the wisdom of selective attention. Just as a master musician knows when to play complex passages and when to rest, you can learn when to think deeply and when to simply exist. The goal is not permanent ignorance, but temporary suspension of the analytical processes that prevent genuine experience. Consider how actors achieve their most powerful performances. They don't become less intelligent, but they temporarily set aside their awareness that they're performing. They allow themselves to believe for a limited time in the reality of their character's world. This is the same skill Schopenhauer is suggesting, the ability to consciously choose your level of awareness based on what serves your well-being in any given moment. The practice begins with what he called aesthetic contemplation, moments when you deliberately lose yourself in beauty without analyzing its components. When you see a sunset, instead of immediately cataloging the atmospheric conditions creating the colors, you train yourself to simply experience the beauty as a child would. When you listen to music, instead of analyzing its technical structure, you allow the emotional impact to wash over you without commentary. This extends to social interactions. Instead of automatically reading between the lines, analyzing hidden motivations, or predicting likely outcomes, you can choose to take interactions at face value. When someone expresses excitement about their plans, you participate in their enthusiasm rather than mentally calculating the probability of success. When someone shares a simple joy, you share it rather than explaining why it's temporary or illusory. Schopenhauer found that this practice required developing what he called the muscle of attention control. Just as you can choose where to look with your eyes, you can learn to choose where to focus your analytical attention. The difference is that this mental muscle requires deliberate training because your default mode is hyperanalysis. The liberation comes from recognizing that your intelligence is a tool, not your identity. You don't have to use a hammer for every problem just because you're skilled with hammers. Similarly, you don't have to apply analytical thinking to every experience just because you're capable of it. The most intelligent approach might be knowing when not to be intelligent. Historical examples support this approach. Einstein was famously able to shift between profound scientific analysis and childlike play. He spoke of thinking in images rather than words, of allowing his mind to wander without direction. Darwin spent hours simply observing nature before applying scientific analysis. They understood that breakthrough insights often come not from more thinking, but from periods of mental rest that allow new patterns to emerge. This practice also extends to what Schopenhauer called strategic social adaptation. Instead of always speaking at your full intellectual capacity, you learn to match the cognitive level of your environment. This isn't deception, it's emotional intelligence. You recognize that most social interactions serve emotional rather than intellectual functions, and you adapt accordingly. The ultimate rebellion against the curse of excessive intelligence is reclaiming your right to experience life at whatever level serves your well-being. You retain your analytical abilities for when they're genuinely useful, solving complex problems, making important decisions, or engaging in intellectual pursuits that bring you joy. But you refuse to let these abilities tyrannize your everyday experience of being human. This is the first step toward what Schopenhauer considered the highest wisdom, the recognition that sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is choose not to be intelligent. The deepest truth Schopenhauer discovered will fundamentally shift how you understand the entire relationship between intelligence and human fulfillment. The goal was never to become more intelligent, it was to become more human. And being fully human requires the wisdom to know when your intelligence serves life and when it destroys it. This realization emerged from Schopenhauer's most profound insight about consciousness itself. He recognized that there are fundamentally two ways of experiencing reality: through the analytical mind that dissects, categorizes, and explains everything, and through what he called pure perception, a state of consciousness that experiences without analyzing, that feels without explaining, that simply is without needing to understand why. Most people stumble into pure perception accidentally, in moments of overwhelming beauty, during deep meditation, in the midst of passionate love, or when completely absorbed in creative work. But Schopenhauer discovered that this state, far from being a primitive or inferior mode of consciousness, might actually be the highest form of human awareness. It's not less than analytical thinking, it's beyond it. This is why children often seem happier than adults, why spiritual traditions emphasize beginner's mind, and why the wisest people throughout history have spoken of returning to simplicity after achieving great complexity of thought. They're not advocating ignorance, they're pointing toward a form of consciousness that includes intelligence, but isn't limited by it. The revolutionary implication is this: your struggle with excessive intelligence isn't a personal failing or an unavoidable burden. It's a stage in the evolution of consciousness. You've developed the analytical capacity to its maximum potential, and now the next step is learning to transcend it without losing it. Like a master who has perfected technique and can now move beyond rigid adherence to rules, you can master the art of moving fluidly between analytical and experiential modes of being. This mastery requires understanding that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Intelligence is the ability to analyze, predict, and understand complex systems. Wisdom is knowing when to use that ability and when to set it aside in service of something more important, your capacity to experience meaning, connection, and joy. Schopenhauer's final insight was that the highest intelligence is meta-intelligence, the intelligence that governs intelligence itself. It's the awareness that can step back and ask, is my analytical thinking serving my well-being right now, or is it preventing me from experiencing something valuable? This meta-awareness allows you to use your intelligence as a tool rather than being used by it. The practical application is profound. Instead of trying to think your way out of overthinking, you learn to simply step out of the thinking process entirely. Instead of analyzing why you can't connect with others, you practice moments of genuine presence. Instead of intellectualizing beauty, you allow yourself to be moved by it. Instead of explaining away mystery, you permit yourself to feel wonder. This doesn't make you less intelligent, it makes you more complete. You become someone who can engage in sophisticated analysis when it's called for, but who can also sit quietly and watch clouds without needing to understand meteorology. You can appreciate a friend's excitement without calculating probabilities, enjoy a sunset without explaining atmospheric physics, and experience love without deconstructing its psychological mechanisms. The ultimate truth, Schopenhauer discovered, is that the purpose of developing intelligence is not to remain trapped in analysis forever, but to develop enough understanding to recognize when understanding itself becomes the obstacle to living. True wisdom is knowing that sometimes the most profound response to existence is not thought, but pure, unanalyzed experience. What would your life look like if you gave yourself permission to be periodically, deliberately, beautifully ignorant? What would you discover if you stopped trying to figure everything out and started experiencing everything fully? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever noticed that your intelligence sometimes gets in the way of your happiness? And if this exploration of Schopenhauer's paradox has challenged your assumptions, share this video with someone who might benefit from questioning whether being smart is always the answer. Sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is remember how to be human